This is going to be Module 2 of the new EMA Orientation program. In this module, we will go over the role of emergency management, the emergency management cycle, public and individual assistance, as well as legal authorities. The objectives by the end of this module will be to examine and define emergency management programs throughout the state of Indiana, explain the intent of these programs, be familiar with the emergency management laws and authorities, and utilize these documents as required. Utilize and be familiar with hazard identification and risk assessments, and review emergency management plans. So the background of emergency management has shifted throughout the years. It was once civil defense, emergency management, and it's shifting more towards homeland security. Emergency management is not just the emergency management agency for a local jurisdiction, but it really involves all the agencies with roles in public safety coming together for the common good of a community. So getting all the stakeholders, both public and private, together at the table is extremely important. Here's a quick video we're going to watch just describing the role of emergency management in a little bit more detail. So one of the key elements in emergency operations of a community is the designation of an emergency management agency and the emergency management director. Under Indiana Code Title 10, each county is required to have an emergency management agency and director, as well as an emergency management plan. During non-emergency and disaster situations, the emergency management director serves as the chief advisor to elected and appointed officials regarding emergency management issues, and they're responsible for coordination of all emergency support functions within the jurisdiction. During emergencies, the EMA director should be the primary disaster expert that should advise county elected officials on disaster-related decisions. It is the director's job to coordinate resources, facilitate teamwork, and coordinate the emergency support functions. The director must facilitate meetings and help bring people together on plans and hazard identification. This is done by conducting hazard analysis and risk assessments, coordinating and developing a comprehensive emergency management plan, which also may be known as an emergency operations plan, assist in mobilizing key personnel and equipment during an event, and becoming familiar with state and federal assistance programs, which can be implemented before, during, and after disasters. Cassie, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the emergency management cycle.
All right. There are 4 phases of the emergency management cycle. Those are mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Mitigation is the prevention of future emergencies or minimizing the effects of those emergencies. Preparedness is preparing to handle an emergency. Response is responding safely to an emergency. And recovery is recovering from the emergency. Threat and risk assessment is one of the first steps in planning for disasters. It is to help you understand the hazards in your community and to determine the risks and potential impacts. Here are some examples of hazard identifications. Those are both natural and human caused. Hazard identification questions are used to assess what the effects are in your area. Some of those questions include, are there warnings? What areas are affected? What is the speed of onset? How long will it last? And when did it last occur? A risk assessment helps to identify how a hazard will impact people, property, and the environment. Next slide, please. Next slide. There we go. Yeah. Mitigation activities lessen the effects, prevent the probability of damage, and eliminate further threats to the citizens during a disaster. Mitigation activities can be in the form of regulations, city or county ordinances, or stricter enforcement of zoning requirements and building codes. A multi-hazard mitigation plan can also be created to help mitigate some of those effects. Preparedness activities readies local governments to respond to natural, technological, and state and national security events through planning, training, and exercising. A comprehensive emergency plan or emergency operations plan shall be developed in advance for the coordination and integration of vital agencies and resources during a disaster. Effective preparedness will assure elected and appointed officials that local government can respond to the greatest extent possible. Response occurs when an incident happens. The primary focus is life safety. It involves activities to meet basic human needs and restore essential services. Successful response depends on effective preparedness. and helps to anticipate cascading events. Ensure information between responders and elected officials and the public is very vital during this time. Recovery activities include, it starts at the time of an incident, it starts to stabilize and continues until all systems have returned to a pre-incident status. Short-term recovery returns vital life support systems to minimum operating standards, and long-term recovery may continue for years after an emergency or disaster. A disaster can be declared or executed by the local jurisdiction, the state, or federal government. This process may make certain assets or resources available to address the emergency. A local declaration is declared by the executive of a political subdivision, and it allows for activation of local plans and authorizes the provisions of aid and assistance. A state declaration is declared by the governor of a single jurisdiction or several jurisdictions for the entire state. And a state declaration allows for activations of state plans, expenditure of funds, initiation of mutual aid agreements, deployments of resources, and the use and distribution of supplies, equipment, materials, and facilities. Suspension of some regulations or statutes are also available during this time, and activation of the National Guard, implementation of protective actions, streamlining of administrative procedures, and access to many federal resources are also available during a state declaration. A presidential declaration, a governor can request a federal disaster declaration, and then the president may provide federal assistance to save lives or prevent severe damage. There are two types of disaster declarations that authorize federal disaster assistance, and that's a emergency declaration and a major disaster declaration. The type and amount of assistance differ depending on the program authorized. When granting a disaster declaration, FEMA will consider the number of homes destroyed or damaged, the concentration of the damage, the impacts it has on the community, other assistance available, and the frequency of the disaster events. The assistance program requires a federal disaster declaration, and we'll be going into further detail about that shortly. Public assistance provides supplemental financial assistance to state and local governments and certain private nonprofit organizations, and requires that the entity meets its own financial threshold. Individual assistance provides services to disaster survivors. There is no official threshold. It is based on the totality of circumstances, and it is difficult to get. Here are some assistance programs that do not require a federal disaster declaration, and that is a Small Business Administration, and it provides low interest disaster loans to businesses of all sizes, private, nonprofit organizations, homeowners, and renters. There's also the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It provides a variety of disaster resources, including protection for homeowners who are unable to pay their mortgage as a result of a disaster. And last but not least, there is the United States Department of Agriculture, and it provides emergency loan funds. At this time, I'm going to give the presentation over to Vincent Grahovic, and he's going to talk about public assistance.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay?
I can hear him.
Okay, so my name's Cody Keith. I will be discussing the specifics within the public assistance program, and then I'll be turning things over to Vincent Grahovic, who will jump into the individual assistance side. Next slide, please. First, we just need to look at what public assistance is. So at a basic level, it is a program that provides financial assistance to state, territorial, federally recognized tribal, and local governments, along with certain private nonprofit organizations in the wake of a major disaster event, specifically presidentially declared disaster events. To kind of piggyback off what we've already been discussing. Effectively, what the program does is that it helps communities recover from disasters of all types, whether they be natural hazards like floods or tornadoes, or other issues such as pandemics. PA program has been very active, particularly within the state of Indiana, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which as of today is still considered an ongoing disaster event. And as Cassie had noted, this is something that's separate from the individual assistance program, which we'll get into shortly. Next slide, please. So this is the general process flow for the public assistance program. First, what we start with is the actual occurrence of a disaster event. From there, we start looking at some of the pre-declaration activities. This would include damage assessment activities, both preliminary damage assessments with local officials and state officials. And then we would jump to a joint preliminary damage assessment where FEMA would become involved, where they would get a chance to actually see what has taken place. From there, if the damage that's been sustained is severe enough and has covered a big enough area, we would be looking at a presidential declaration. From there, we would be looking to the affected organizations, or as they're often referred to as applicants, would submit their official requests for public assistance. Those are referred to most generally as RPAs. That is all something that is now done through the FEMA grants portal system, which we'll touch on again a bit later. Also, through that system, once an RPA has been submitted, reviewed, and approved by the state and by FEMA, those organizations will then have the ability to develop what's called a project application or multiple project applications, where they outline the effects that they have suffered as a result of that disaster event. They outline not just the damages themselves, but also the costs that have been accumulated throughout that event. From there, the applicant would look to complete the work itself to make sure that their facilities are returned back to their pre-disaster conditions. They'll work with the state and with FEMA to close out their projects and make sure that they get reimbursements for all of their eligible costs. Next slide, please. So the first thing we have to look at, and this is true both of us at the state and those on the FEMA side, we have to look at eligibility as it pertains to FEMA's PA program. And the most basic way to look at it is with the pyramid in front of us here, where we're basically working our way up from the bottom. We first have to look at the applicant organization itself and kind of what their structure is as an organization. From there, we have to look at any eligible facilities that they have and the area in which those facilities are located. We then have to look at the work that they're doing as a part of their recovery efforts and their efforts to get back to pre-disaster conditions. And we have to look at the cost of that work. And we'll look at each of these four pieces individually as we continue. And first, of course, we'll be looking at the applicants themselves. Some of the more common examples of applicants within the PA program would include state agencies. County highway departments are especially common, along with municipal parks, public works departments, emergency service organizations like police, fire, and EMS departments. County EMAs are also a very frequent applicant in disaster events and oftentimes serve to help coordinate some of the work that's being done even in the grants portal as a part of the development of a project application. Away from the governmental entities, we also look at private nonprofits. Most often, those organizations are ones that provide services similar to that of a government agency. So looking at educational facilities, medical facilities, utility organizations, again, emergency services, looking again at fire protection, ambulance services, things like that. Next slide. Common examples of ineligible applicants would include primarily private for-profit businesses. For-profit entities are not eligible under FEMA's public assistance program. It's not to say that there aren't other funding sources for those organizations in the event of a disaster. Specifically, the PA program would not be one that would be eligible for. Along with for-profit entities, we'd be looking at unimproved properties, agricultural land. As far as unimproved properties are concerned, one example of this would be like a floodplain. The facility itself would have to have some sort of man-made improvement to the structure and not just a natural landscape just on its own. Next slide. So moving from applicant to facility, we have to look at the facilities that are under the responsibility of that applicant. They have to also be located in a designated area or a declared county in that disaster event. They also cannot be under the authority of another federal agency, such as NRCS or USAID. One example of this would be if, say, a highway department is registering for assistance, they cannot claim damages to a highway that would be under the authority of federal aid highway. And knowing that information in advance helps to kind of expedite the process a little bit when projects are being developed. Just knowing what facilities would and would not be applicable to PA just helps everyone involved. Moving from facilities to work, the work itself that's being performed has to be required as a result of the disaster event itself and has to be the legal responsibility of the applicant that's requesting the assistance for that work. Similar to the facility, it has to be located in a designated disaster area or a declared county and has to be required in order to return the facility or the affected area to pre-disaster conditions or conditions that have been pre-approved by FEMA. The important note here is that FEMA will, in some situations, account for hazard mitigation as a part of this work that's being done, but that has to be discussed with FEMA and approved by them before they will reimburse any of the costs associated with that work. So work is broken up into categories within the PA program, and I won't go through each individual letter there. It shows what encompasses each category. But the important distinction is between emergency work and permanent work. Most often, we'll see that disaster events incorporate at least categories A and B, because those are most frequently some of the issues that come up in the wake of a disaster event. Take a flood, for example. There's almost always some debris removal that has to be done in some form of emergency protective measure that has to be taken in the response to that event. Away from those, looking at permanent work, we're looking at the replacement or repair of permanent facilities, of roads and bridges, buildings, utility facilities, parks. That is something that FEMA will account for. They do give a couple of different timeframes to work with in the completion of emergency work versus permanent work. So just something to keep in mind anytime a project is being developed. Looking at cost, FEMA will look at any force account labor that was done to complete the work itself. They'll want to see some labor records to that effect. They'll take into account any fringe benefits that would be applicable for those staff members. They'll look at equipment usage that's owned by the applicant, and FEMA does provide what they call their FEMA schedule of equipment rates that will list how much it costs to operate certain pieces of equipment. They'll also want to see documentation related to materials that have been purchased. or materials that have been pulled from an existing stock. Away from that, FEMA will also want to look at anything related to a contract. So if a contract was utilized, they'll want to see a copy of the contract itself, as well as anything related to the bidding on that contract. But just all encompassing of those factors, FEMA does require that those costs be the result of the disaster event and that they be adequately documented. So I'd mentioned this previously, the FEMA grants portal is effectively the new system that's used by FEMA, by us at the state, and by local applicants in the administration of anything specific to the PA program. So an RPA would now be submitted through this system. The projects themselves are all developed here. The site more or less serves as the one-stop shop for the development of a PA grant and its individual project applications. The portal itself does provide some training resources in the site for those who might be new to the system. And we at the state level can also answer some questions about the system applicants coming into that system for the first time. Away from the portal, there are a few other programmatic resources that we always recommend that people take advantage of. Our staff with IDHS, of course, is available to answer questions that might come up. The most common document that we point our applicants toward would be FEMA's Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide, also known as PAPPG. This document essentially serves as the framework to the public assistance program as a whole. If you have questions about eligibility, about what types of documentation need to be collected, all of that is outlined in specificity in that document. It's a very lengthy document, not what I would call a fun read, but very informative and something that I recommend to be on hand for any applicant in a disaster event. Away from that, there's also information available on IDHS's public assistance webpage and FEMA.gov if you're ever looking online for those resources. We do have a couple of links there for the resources I just referenced. Definitely worth hanging on to if you end up needing to access those directly. And for now, I will go ahead and pass things over to Vincent, who is going to run through the specifics on the individual.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Alrighty. So hello, my name is Vincent Grahovic, and I'm the Individual Assistance Program Manager for the Indiana Department of Homeland Security. In this portion of the presentation, we will be going over the updated criteria for requesting a federal disaster declaration and just IA in general. So first off, we will briefly touch on why the federal disaster declaration criteria may be different from what some people may remember or have experienced in the past. And that is because of the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act. The Sandy Recovery Improvement Act was legislation that was passed, which essentially made the emergency management industry examine and kind of audit itself from a macro level to determine the best practices, in the hopes that it would lead to providing more objective criteria, clarifying the threshold for eligibility, and speeding up the disaster declaration process. Next slide. By the end of this presentation, you should have a better understanding of how these changes may impact your part of the emergency management process. For those of you who aren't familiar, when discussing individual assistance, we are focusing on homeowners, renters, and businesses. The first and frankly most important criteria for the updated factors is the state physical capacity and resource availability. What this is essentially saying is why this is important is that if the federal government believes the disaster can be handled by the state and with state resources, they expect the state to handle it. So accurately tracking resource availability and expenditures, two key factors for this criteria, is that much more important. Next slide, please. Things like the state's total taxable resources and the cost to capacity ratio aren't necessarily things you as EMAs are expected to know or calculate. Those algorithms are calculated mostly internally. but we do feel it is important to fully understand the process. So I'll briefly touch on an example. Here's how FEMA would evaluate an IA request, and we will use a real-world example, DR 4363. DR 4363 was estimated to cost over $19 million. The state's total taxable resources is released in a document every several years, and in 2018, that number was $380.4 billion. Reducing that figure to millions, we get 380,400. Now, we plug that number into the estimated cost of the disaster, and we get a cost to capacity ratio of 52.22. What does this number mean? It's as simple as plugging it into this FEMA provided graph. This gives us a likelihood, not guarantee, for approval before other factors or criteria are taken into account. If your ICC ratio is more than 25 and your estimated cost is more than 7.5 million, you have a 90% chance of approval. If your ICC ratio is less than 10 and your estimated cost of a disaster is less than 1.5 million, there's less than 10% chance of approval. Next slide. This slide explains how that estimated cost of assistance factors into the chart on the previous page. We won't go into the minutia of calculating the estimated cost of assistance in a request right now. Just know that the estimated cost of assistance for your individual community is going to be a more important part of this process for you. Next slide. This slide explains how the cost to capacity ratio factors into the likelihood of approval chart. It's based on real-world disaster events. One second. Can you go back a slide? Can you go back one more? I'm sorry. All right. Yeah, so these are again, this is the chart that was based on those real world events. Okay, sorry, go forward again. My apologies. All right, so I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but estimated cost of assistance and the cost to capacity ratio do not represent hard thresholds. The possibility of being denied still exists even if we meet 90% likelihood of approval. After the evaluation of the principal factors, FEMA will consider additional relevant factors, and we here at the state have the ability to make that case through the additional data we get from you at the local level. Next slide, please. We make our case through uninsured home and personal property losses, disaster impacted population profile, impact to community infrastructure, casualties, disaster related unemployment. We also make our case from some additional data points that we get from you that may be relevant, like feeding stations, sheltering operations, search and rescue operations, damage to critical infrastructure, agricultural or livestock considerations, and virtually anything else you can think of. So where does that leave us? How does that impact our declaration process? All factors are extensively linked to the IA damage assessment. We must work harder, faster, and smarter to locate all residential structural damages. Residential damages in the minor affected categories might need assessments during the JPDA to increase the projected IHP estimate. And greater consistency on the degree of damage during the assessment is also very important. Next slide. And that concludes the individual assistance portion of this presentation. I will hand it back over to Stormy.
Thank you, Vincent. So next, we're just going to go over some of the laws and authorities applicable to emergency management. So at the federal level, we're looking at presidential directives, the Stafford Act, SARA Title III, and the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, as well as the National Response Plan. So the Stafford Act provides the statutory authority for most federal disaster response, recovery, and mitigation activities, as well as preparedness funding. Here's just a couple links to some presidential directives and the national planning frameworks. State laws include the Governor's Executive Order, Indiana Code Title 1013 and Indiana Code Title 1014, the All Hazards Mitigation Plan, and the State Response Plan. So Title 10, if you look at 1014-3, it establishes an advisory council for emergency management, and it states a county shall maintain a county emergency management advisory council and an emergency management organization, or participate in an interjurisdictional disaster agency that, except as otherwise provided under this chapter, may have jurisdiction over and serve the entire county. So for the Emergency Management Advisory Council, there are several individuals that need to be a part of that. It should be the president of the county executive, the president of the county fiscal body, the mayor of each city located within the county, an individual representing the legislative bodies of all towns located within the county, and Civil Air Patrol. The advisory board is established to exercise general supervision and control over the emergency management program and select or cause to be selected with the approval of the county executive, a county emergency management and disaster director. The director has the direct responsibility for the organization, administration, and operation of the emergency management program within the county. So some of the local laws and authorities are local executive orders, local ordinances, your LEPC, your all hazards mitigation plan, and the comprehensive emergency management plan, or it might otherwise be known as emergency operations plan. So elected officials should be involved in emergency management. They should be familiar with the applicable authorities, review those local authorities, and insist in revisions as required, such as your EMA ordinance, and consult with local legal representatives to clarify any legal issues if they do arise. So the role of the Indiana Department of Homeland Security, we support preparedness activities such as planning, training, exercise, grants. We have the local government support section, field staff, the State Emergency Operations Center, and then disaster recovery and mitigation. So the local government support section is established to provide comprehensive emergency management and homeland security guidance and act as technical consultants to local emergency management agencies. They also work closely with first responders, hospitals, and universities. So the state EOC is the primary physical location for state level information sharing and resource coordination. And during an emergency, the state EOC facilitates close coordination between responsible agencies for effective response. So they have 4 activation levels. As you can see below, level 4 is just daily operations. Level 3 is when you're bringing in some of those emergency support functions. Level 2 is all of those emergency support functions, and then level 1 is the policy group. Within the state EOC is also the IDHS watch desk, which is 24/7, 365 days a year. They're the primary point of contact. They're going to be providing situational awareness, whether it be for weather, road closures, any event that's impacting the safety of citizens or responders within Indiana. You can see their phone number below, so you can call them at any time if you do have an incident within your county, or you can call your liaison to relay that information. You can connect with IDHS through a variety of ways, one of which is to sign up for the Hoosier Responder magazine that you can see below. And if you do have a story or want to share information for the EMA Roundup, you can always email PIO. They love seeing your stories and getting pictures and sharing those throughout the state. IDHS is also on social media. Facebook, our website, Instagram, Twitter. You can follow us on any of those platforms. So as a result of Module 2, you should be able to understand how emergency management functions in Indiana and initial steps to help establish your program. You should be able to explain the intent of EMA programs, the phases of emergency management, hazard identification and risk assessment, and the applicable laws and authorities here in Indiana. Thank you for taking the time out to watch Module 2 of the new EMA Orientation seminar.